Baghdad, February 1258. The Tigris is drinking. First, it drinks ink. Thousands upon thousands of books have been torn from the libraries of Baghdad and hurled into the river. Their pages open beneath the surface like pale hands. Black spreads through the current until the water itself seems to become a manuscript. Then the color changes. Black becomes red. The ink of the dead is swallowed by the blood of the people who wrote it. That is the legend. It says books covered the river so thickly that Mongol horses crossed without wetting their hooves. It says the House of Wisdom burned, the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad was sealed inside a carpet, and 5 centuries of science died beneath the same cavalry charge. One city, one fire, one perfect ending for an entire civilization. But look beyond the smoke. Among the archers, engineers, and Mongol commanders rides a man with no sword in his hand. He carries calculations. He studies the stars. And before this story is over, he will persuade the destroyer of Baghdad to finance one of the most advanced scientific machines on Earth. His name is Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. How did a scientist survive inside the army accused of killing science itself? To answer that, Baghdad must first fall. And inside its walls, a caliph is about to gamble everything on a title that no longer commands an empire. Before the Black River, there was a golden illusion. For nearly 5 centuries, Baghdad had spoken with the weight of the Abbasid name. Even after its empire fractured, the city still looked untouchable, rich, sacred, and wrapped in the memory of former power. At its center sat the caliph, al-Mustasim. He possessed enormous prestige, immense wealth, and painfully limited military strength. He sat inside a golden cage and mistook its reflection for the sun. Then Hulagu Khan sent his demand: submit, tear down the defenses, accept Mongol rule. Hulagu was a grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of the Great Khan, and commander of a multinational imperial war machine. Cavalry from the steppe, allied troops from conquered lands, engineers carrying the accumulated lessons of wars fought across Asia. The army had already dismantled cities and kingdoms. Baghdad was next. The caliph refused. His advisors insisted that the Muslim world would rise to defend him. They warned that no conqueror could strike Baghdad and survive the vengeance that followed. But while the court argued, Mongol signal fires multiplied beyond the walls. No great rescue army appeared. The caliph threatened a physical war machine with the memory of an empire. Hulagu gave the order. His columns divided, crossed the rivers, and began closing around Baghdad from both sides. The city was already dying. It simply did not know the date of its funeral. The first Mongol blow did not land on the walls. It landed on the army sent out to save the city. Baghdad's cavalry rode beyond the city, expecting space to maneuver. Mongol units pulled them farther onto the plain. Then engineers attacked the surrounding embankments. Water spread across the low ground. Firm earth became mud. Retreat narrowed. Horses lost their footing. Formations broke apart as Mongol riders closed from both sides. Men who had marched out beneath bright Abbasid banners vanished into water, arrows and steel. The field army was destroyed. Survivors raced back toward Baghdad. Mongol cavalry reached the gates with them. Defenders were forced to close the doors while their own soldiers died outside. Now Baghdad stood alone. Across the Tigris, roads disappeared behind cavalry screens. Earthworks rose. Trenches cut through escape routes. A wooden ring began tightening around the city. Then the engineers moved forward. Date palms crashed to the ground. Timber was stripped, measured, and dragged toward the walls. Great siege engines rose from the groves surrounding Baghdad, their throwing arms towering above men and horses. The Mongols had turned the landscape into a weapon factory. Then the engines spoke. Stone projectiles crossed the sky. Incendiary pots burst against towers and rooftops. Every impact shook dust from ceilings deep inside the city. Families heard the siege before they saw it. The groan of timber, the whistle overhead, a heartbeat of silence, and then the blow. At night, Baghdad could not sleep. Each launch began with a wooden scream in the darkness, followed by a silence long enough for every family to wonder whose house had been chosen. The defenders answered with arrows and fire. The Mongols answered with calculation, range, weight, angle, impact. Every night, new engines appeared. Every morning, another section of wall leaned toward collapse. Inside the palace, messengers ran through corridors with reports that grew worse by the hour. Outside, Mongol engineers were already measuring the next target. Then the eastern defenses split open. Brick, timber, and men disappeared inside a cloud of dust. Mongol banners climbed above the breach. From inside Baghdad, it must have looked as if the horizon itself had mounted the wall. The caliph finally offered surrender. Hulagu had stopped listening. The gates opened, and the Mongols entered. For days, Baghdad became a machine of fire, plunder, and death. Palaces were stripped, doors were smashed open. People hiding beneath floors and behind sealed walls were dragged into streets already thick with smoke. Collections vanished into flames, wagons, water, and private hands. Medieval accounts offered death tolls from tens of thousands to numbers beyond belief. The final count is lost. The scale of the killing is not. The Mongols had spent years traveling toward Baghdad. Now they were dismantling 5 centuries of imperial memory, room by room. And for the caliph who believed himself untouchable, the true horror had been saved for last. Hulagu captured al-Mustasim alive. The version of his death that conquered memory begins with a problem. Royal blood was not supposed to touch the earth. To spill the blood of a sovereign risked offending eternal heaven. The story says the conquerors found a loophole. A magnificent Persian carpet was unrolled on the ground, the symbol of a court that had wrapped itself in luxury while an army closed around it. The caliph was forced onto the fabric. Then the carpet closed. Imagine the darkness, the heat trapped inside the heavy wool, the dust filling his mouth. The ruler who had believed the entire Islamic world would rise at his command could no longer move his arms. Then he felt a vibration beneath him, at first distant, then closer. The sound of armored Mongol horses accelerating across the ground. One passed over the carpet, then another, then the full weight of the cavalry. No blade, no royal blood staining the soil. Only the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad disappearing beneath hooves. The political world of Abbasid Baghdad ended in darkness. At the same time, libraries and collections were being torn apart. Books burned, books were stolen. Books entered the river. The city was broken. The caliph was dead. The water turned black. And this is where most versions end. But listen, the hoofbeats stop. The fire falls to a hiss. The battlefield becomes silent. And the siege story becomes a crime scene. Return to the river. Now follow the clues. The earliest accounts give us fire, slaughter, and books destroyed. A century passes, the water darkens. Another retelling. The books multiply. Then the floating pages become a bridge strong enough to carry horses. Then one chronicler names the Euphrates, the wrong river. The story grows more certain as memory grows less precise. Memory has become theater. The carpet may belong to that same machinery of memory. A famous ending, powerful enough to survive even when its exact details cannot be proven. That does not mean Baghdad's books escaped. Collections burned, scattered, and vanished. Unique works were lost forever. But a river dyed black for days is not an inventory. It is grief transformed into cinema. And behind that perfect image sits an even larger illusion. One golden building containing the mind of an age. Picture the legendary House of Wisdom, a golden dome, endless shelves. Every translator, physician, mathematician, and astronomer gathered inside. Now let the image shatter. By 1258, the original institution may already have faded or changed beyond recognition. Baghdad's intellectual world had escaped any single building long before Hulagu arrived. It moved through court libraries, hospitals, and colleges, through physicians' chests, students' saddlebags, and manuscripts locked inside caravans. It moved through patrons, translators, copyists, teachers, and students. And by the 13th century, it had traveled far beyond the city. A book copied in Iraq could be taught in Syria, corrected in Egypt, and debated in Iran. A manuscript might burn in Baghdad while another copy survived elsewhere. A refugee might carry a folded text beneath his clothes. A student might carry no book at all, only the calculations taught by a dead master. A city can be surrounded, a network cannot. Baghdad's intellectual world did not begin moving after the Mongols arrived. It was already in motion, which brings us back to the weaponless rider from the opening. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was a mathematician, philosopher, and astronomer, one of the most formidable minds of his century. Before Baghdad, he had lived among the mountain strongholds of the Nizari Ismailis. When Hulagu destroyed those fortresses, Tusi did more than survive. He made himself useful to the man destroying his world. The Mongols could be spectacularly destructive. They were also brutally practical. They wanted engineers who could build machines, administrators who could control conquered lands, physicians who could preserve valuable lives, astrologers who claimed they could read victory in the movement of the heavens. Mongol rulers took eclipses, omens, and astrological timing seriously. Tusi turned that fear into leverage. Whatever choices had brought him there, he made knowledge valuable inside the Mongol machine. While Hulagu's armies conquered cities, Tusi gained authority, access, and a patron with the resources of an empire. Then he proposed something extraordinary: a machine for measuring the sky. In 1259, only a year after the supposed death of Islamic science, construction began at Maragha in northwestern Iran. At first, the mountain was empty. Then stone began climbing the slope. Convoys arrived carrying timber, metal, instruments, and books, collected from across the lands now controlled by the Mongols. Masons cut foundations into the earth. Craftsmen assembled great arcs, circles, and sighting devices. Scholars arrived from different cities and traditions. And Hulagu, the destroyer of Baghdad, paid for it. At night, observers hauled the new instruments into position and waited for stars to cross lines cut into brass and stone. The conqueror of the caliphate became patron to an observatory. That does not redeem him. No tower at Maragha could rebuild the homes burned in Baghdad. No table of stars could restore the dead, but it destroys the clean switch from light to darkness. Maragha became one of the most advanced scientific centers of the medieval world. Its astronomers tested and rebuilt the old models inherited from Ptolemy. Tusi created an elegant geometric device, two circles producing motion along a straight line. Centuries later, strikingly similar geometry appears in the work of Copernicus. Now watch the image transform. The Mongol siege circle becomes the ring of an astronomical instrument. The throwing arm of a trebuchet becomes a sighting rule. Stones that smashed a wall become stones raised into an observatory. Fire becomes stars. The same imperial expansion that shattered older institutions created new routes for scholars, texts, and patronage. Knowledge survived because texts moved. Scholars adapted, and even conquerors could be made to need what they had failed to destroy. The science of Baghdad did not simply die. It changed location, it changed patrons, and it made the Mongols themselves part of its future. But the greatest surprise was not on the mountain. It was back inside the city everyone had already declared dead. Even Baghdad refused to remain a grave. While Maragha aimed at the stars, doors were reopening inside the city everyone had declared dead. People returned to the ruins. Schools reopened. Manuscripts were copied again. Within roughly a year, the great Mustansiriya Madrasa was functioning under the same Mongol order that had destroyed the old regime. So what truly died in Baghdad? The Abbasid dynasty in Baghdad died. The caliph's court, its wealth, and its political universe died. Countless people were killed. Families, neighborhoods, and chains of memory were cut apart. Unique books vanished forever, and Baghdad lost something it would never recover: its place at the center of the world. That catastrophe was real. But civilization did not have a single brain waiting inside a single library. The House of Wisdom was not the only light. The Tigris did not carry all human knowledge into the sea. The intellectual world scattered into other cities, copied manuscripts, refugees, students, survivors, and new institutions financed by the conquerors themselves. The legend of the Black River survives because it gives catastrophe a color. But the deeper truth gives it motion. Knowledge runs, hides, crosses borders, and changes masters. It makes itself useful to people who do not understand what they are helping preserve. The caliphate in Baghdad died beneath Mongol hooves, but science stole the conqueror's horse and rode on.